All right, Robert, you are good to go.
Good morning. I'm Robert Brown, Director of the Bioeconomy Institute and a faculty member at Iowa State University. It is my pleasure to host today's conversations about carbon with Dr. Bernardo del Campo, President of Advanced Renewable Technology International, better known as ARTi, a company developing pyrolysis technology and producing biochar for a variety of applications. Dr. Del Campo received his PhD from Iowa State University in mechanical engineering in 2015. During his studies, he founded ARTi with two other graduate students. And with that, I'm going to start with the first question. Bernie, tell us about yourself and how you started ARTi.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be a student of yours again. So we started ARTi 9 years ago. We were studying in Iowa State. We were doing our PhD with several other students, Juan Proano, Matt Kiefer, Edson, Ben Drusculo, and a colleague of mine, Dan Wilson, helped us out with this endeavor. And we're doing amazing things in the lab, so we decided that this was the time to go commercial. And well, from there, we founded ARTi. And from then on, we started doing biochar technologies related projects, all of them, from reactors to R&D to developing products out of carbon, out of our pyrolysis system. But yes, basically we started 9 years ago, a bunch of graduate students from Iowa State, and we started to make this real.
And go ahead, Bernie. Yes.
Do you want me to tell you a little bit about myself first?
Please.
Sure. So I come from Uruguay. I have a family farm that I used to work there quite a bit. And I did some research in a research institution in Uruguay. It's called INEA. I always loved research. I economist engineer degree in Uruguay. And then I had the pleasure, the opportunity to come here to the United States to work for Pioneer, currently Corteva, and work with wonderful people. We did a lot of engineering and molecular breeding and hybrid engineering. From then on, I met Tom Brown in Iowa State, and then I became a master's student for Tom Brown. And later on, I met Dr. Brown, and I became a PhD student, and I did my mechanical engineer degree with Dr. Brown. And then was when I started working in ARTi with my colleagues, trying to make this pyrolysis product, the biochar, that at the moment wasn't look like a product, more like a waste. Trying to bring it up as a product, develop it, and well, create a company based on this solid product.
Well, that transitions into my next question. Could you tell the audience what biochar is? Some people will be familiar with it. Some will say, what is this material? And can you tell us how it could be used as a carbon sequestration agent, among other things?
Yep. Among everything. We can do anything with biochar,
right? I make the same claim too, Bernie.
Excellent. So let's start a little bit with biochar. And I'm going to start defining it how I don't like to define it. But I think in layman terms, it's better understood that way. So biochar is a charcoal-like material, okay, that we make it from the pyrolysis of biomass. That's how we make it. Okay, now let's break it down into the different components. Why we say it's a charcoal-like material? It looks like charcoal. It is a charcoal, okay? But we do it in such a way that we grab biomass, and let me define biomass. Biomass is any biological material. The most commonly ones that we use is wood chips, for example, right? Anything that comes from a plant base, but also is animal base or industrial waste. All sorts of things that are organic material, okay? And actually there are companies doing plastics and some other things that come actually from fossil, but that is not biochar, okay? So biochar comes from biological materials. We grab the material and we put it in a reactor, in a kiln, and we heat it up at high temperatures with little to no oxygen, and we make a carbon, right? What it happens is actually the carbon start fusing itself and make these rings of carbon, and that's the biochar. You pretty much concentrate the carbon that there was before in the original material, in a wood chip, for example, and you turn it into biochar, and it looks like a black wood chip at the end, right? But basically what you're doing is you're concentrating the carbon, and many other of the elements comes out as gases or bioil, what we were studying in Iowa State. So now we're focusing on the solid residue. The solid residue is the biochar. And again, biochar, you can make it with many different systems, many different processes. We do pyrolysis. Pyrolysis is basically pyro is fire, and lysis is breaking. We break that biomass, that wood, we break it down with the heat, and then we concentrate the carbon. The carbon start fusing each other, and you make this charcoal-like material. And the rest comes out as gases and bioil. In Iowa State, we were focusing on bioil, and we were condensing that bioil, and it looks like crude, like petroleum crude. But in ARTi, we're focusing on the solid residue, which is the biochar. And there's many other technologies. We use pyrolysis, but there are many other technologies to do solid carbon products, like what we do. In all of them, as you change the processing conditions and the system and the biomass that you're using, you're making different types of carbon. And that is something that is, it's a little tough to understand. And that's why I'd like to get out of this concept of charcoal, because then we put it in the same bag. It's all charcoal. Well, it's not charcoal, it's biochar for soil, and you can make it in many different ways. And that biochar for soils can have many different characteristics, suited more for one application or the other. But basically, what are the things that we change? We change the temperature, number one parameter. We change the residence time. We change the feedstock that we use. For example, I'm going to talk later, but we're using wood chips. We're using oat hulls. We have been pyrolyzing chicken litter, for example. All sorts of different products that at the end, they look black. They look like charcoal. But at the end, they're very different, chemically, physically, and what they can do. So that's why we refer as carbon products. And carbon products, one of them being biochar, which is for soil. But in ARTi, we do many things. We do carbon feedstocks for activation, for filtration, and we call them activated carbon. We do carbon black replacements. So in the plastics, we have black plastics all over. My watch here is black. In these plastics, you use a carbon, which is chemically different, but it's a carbon, and that carbon we can do replacement of those based on biomass, making organics, making renewable, okay? So in a nutshell, that is biochar. It's a charcoal-like material, right? No. Well, it's a charcoal-like material for soil, but it's actually very different depending on how you do it, okay? That is biochar.
So Bernie, there's a lot of talk about carbon sequestration. Governor Reynolds has established a carbon sequestration task force. And can you tell us briefly what carbon sequestration is and how biochar, that concept?
Absolutely. So I would say that one of the things that kind of fascinated me from when I was studying in Iowa State, and why I decided to move on. First of all, I went to Iowa State to do biofuels, and biofuels is certainly a wonderful thing to develop as a society. But on the other hand, I saw something that it was kind of difficult to convey. And when you do biochar and you put it in soils, you start making your soils black. You increase your organic carbon, you increase your organic matter in the soil for hundreds of years. So that's what kind of fascinated me on the thermochemical processing that we're doing in Iowa State, pyrolysis, okay? I step back a little bit and say, well, why biochar sequester carbon, okay? And I try to explain, again, in general terms, how biochar sequester carbon, which is not simple. It is not simple for everyone. So we'll try to do a little bit of effort trying to make it simple. So actually, the biochar doesn't sequester carbon. The plant sequester the carbon. The plant fixes the carbon. And the biochar locks it in a structure that it cannot be broken down easily. So it stays in the soil for hundreds of years. So if we want to explain it as, the plant will grow. As it grows, it's absorbing the CO2 from the air, right? Go back to the primary courses in school. They grows sunlight, water, CO2 from the air, and it makes the sugar. That sugar ends up making all the different components from the plants, the root, the stems, the leaves, the flower, all of them have carbon, okay? And if we remove the water, we'll say that a plant, I mean, generally speaking, is 50% of carbon. It's not, but it's a little less, but 50% of carbon, okay? So half of that is carbon. And that's what is, the plants sequester the carbon, but the plants normally will die, right? And that biomass will be respirated by the microbes, and it will turn into CO2 back again. The same as when you do compost. You have compost pile, and then 6 months after we have a third. Well, all that is the microbes that are chewing and eating that biomass. So instead of having the material die, what we do is we pyrolyze it. We make it into biochar, and now that carbon locks it into this aromatic structure that is very hard to break down. So in general terms, you have a plant with 50% of carbon, less than 50, and then we process it. And from that carbon, approximately 50% will stay in the biochar. And that biochar, again, is very recalcitrant. That means that it doesn't break down. So you put it in the soil, and that carbon that once was in the air, then was in the plant, now is in my biochar, and now is in the soil, stays there for hundreds to thousands of years in the ground. Obviously, if you use the biochar for fuel, then you don't sequester anything because you're burning it back again. It goes back up into the atmosphere in your chimney or in the tailpipe of your car. You're burning. So when you burn, you produce CO2. So in a nutshell, that is how biochar sequester carbon. The plant sequester, biochar lock it, and if you use it wisely, you have an enormous potential to sequester carbon in a very useful way, because it's not just carbon that you're sequestering. You're doing all sorts of other environmental benefits in the soil. And let me step back a little bit and throw out a couple of concepts, of terms for the public to look into. And people say, well, how do you prove us that you're actually making this char, and this char stays in the soil for hundreds of years or thousands of years, right? We got biochars for 1,000 years. Well, there's many ways to prove it, right? But I would say the more pragmatic one that I enjoy a little bit of it is terra preta. Terra preta are soils in Brazil. So those are terra, it's dirt, and preta means black. So they're dark soils that they're in the Amazon rainforest, which have been made by Indians. And researchers have been finding all sorts of pottery clays and some other things in the soil. And then we start realizing that that soil is not actually native soil. It is native soil that has been transformed with the use of charcoal, right? The Indians were making charcoal and burying it in the soil. And that charcoal, we can go as scientists and we can pick a little bit of that and we put it in very expensive equipment, and we can know when was that charcoal made. So we have terra preta soils that they're 1,000 years old, 2,000 and 8,000 years old. So you have the most pragmatic carbon sequestration technology made by the Indians. And the funniest part is the Indians made it, and we're still trying to figure out how we can make it profitable and implement it in a large scale, right? But I mean, the Indians did it. It's right there. And something that actually struck me is that slowly we start in other environments, in other situations, we start realizing the same with our soils. And many of our soils, we have a very nice blog in our website. I want to encourage you to read it. But many of our soils, they have pyrogenic carbon. Pyrogenic, it means from fire. So natural fires will burn the biomass. Some of that will burn, literally produce CO2. Some of that will char. And when it chars, it produces a carbon. And that carbon stays in the soil, and that soil improves the soil. Here in the Midwest, there were scientists from Iowa State, and they published several papers. One of them was very nice and explained that roughly 30 or 40% of the carbon in the soil is pyrogenic, comes from fires. And the same thing, you can measure it and you can tell roughly when that carbon was made, all right? So pragmatically, we sequester lots of carbons, right? We didn't know about it. It's pretty interesting. Was it that clear, Dr. Brown, or should I emphasize?
No, I think that's the analogy with these terra preta soils is really important, and this can happen in other soils as well. So I appreciate that explanation. And I want to offer the audience to start putting some questions in the chat, and I'll refer to that. Some of them are coming in. But I've got one question more that I would like to ask you, Bernie, to elaborate on. I'm familiar that you're developing a program to encourage sequestration of carbon dioxide via biochar. Could you take a few minutes to describe that program to us?
Yes, absolutely. So it is kind of funny, actually, but the sequestration part of biochar before was an emblematic, characteristic of the biochar. So I would say 5 years ago, we'll talk to all these people, say, well, this is carbon sequestration. The greatest of carbon sequestration is here on the biochar. And, no one, it was more like a marketing tool than anything else. But now I have calls from colleagues of mine. They're asking me if the biochar sequester carbon, and if actually they can buy a machine to sequester carbon, which has fundamentally changed our approach to this technology. So what we are launching today is iTrap CO2, okay? And we have we're doing two things on the carbon sequestration, right? We're sequestering carbon as we produce biochar every day, okay? But we're doing two programs. The most important that we're launching today is iTrap CO2. And I encourage you to go to the website, ARTi.com website or itrapco2.com website. And then you can find a lot more about us and what we're trying to do. But basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be producing biochar, and you're going to go into the website. You're going to buy carbon, CO2. You're going to buy it. And then that biochar that we create to comply with that CO2 sequestration that you're paying, we're going to be donated to different institutions that are signing into our website so they can be donors, right? So we can put this biochar into nonprofits, into all these places that they would love to have it. So we are starting this program, iTrap CO2, and all this was initially started the idea from Mass Foundation, where they released a competition for $100 million for showing what is the best technology for sequestering carbon dioxide. And we said, well, not 100, but a couple of those would be nice to have. So we decided, you know what, we sign in and we're going to move forward and we're going to present this to the Mass Foundation. So that's what we did. And just recently we said, well, let's start truly, offering this to the public. So the public can go and say, I want to sequester a ton of CO2. And you buy it, and we donate this to any foundations that they want to do. So that's how we started iTrap. And on this side, we also started more the industrial scale of carbon sequestration. You probably heard that Microsoft is paying for carbon sequestration credits, and Spotify, and many others of those. They started, and actually, they're not just looking for carbon sequestration, but they're looking for biochar sequestration, because it's different to others. Is carbon? It could be carbon. It is carbon negative in many situations. Technology, right? So we sign into Puro. It's a platform in Europe that they actually, companies and people go and buy carbon credits, and then those platforms we deliver. We produce the biochar from the CO2 that has been purchased. And for that, we have two feedstocks that we're assigning for that platform. So wood chips and oat hulls, we're currently paralyzing that. And that is going to be certified soon. And soon we're going to be making credits for the general clients, for companies to buy. But you as an individual, you can certainly, promote this and go into our website and buy, 50 pounds of CO2 or a ton of CO2 or 10 tons of CO2. And you can say, well, I'm going to offset my trip that I need to go, somewhere, and I have fun somewhere else. And I'm going to sequester in the biochar 100 pounds of CO2. And now you can do it. Was it clear, Dr. Ron, or should I?
Yes, thank you. And again, I encourage the audience to go, if you'll Google ARTi, first thing up is ARTi TV. Go to the next entry, which is going to be Advanced Renewable Technology International, which is Bernie's company, for more details. We've got some questions coming in. I'm actually going to start with one that is a comment, because I'd like Bernie to respond to it. The comment is, many indigenous peoples practice what was looked down on as slash and burn agriculture, including the indigenous people of the U.S. plains. By rotating fields and providing biochar through the burned materials, the land stayed fertile for millennia. We can learn from indigenous technologies supported by advanced science, not just depending on expensive and questionable technologies. So the question to me that comes to my mind is biochar also an expensive and questionable technology as described here for others?
Fantastic. So let me start with the basics. So we don't like slash and char. Slash and burn. We don't like slash and burn. So in agricultural practice, it's very common is burn everything. And I've seen burns, prairies, forest, and stuff like that. So when you truly burn, you produce CO2 and you produce in ashes. There's no carbon remaining, very little, no organic carbon remaining. So what we like to say is, yes, you can produce some of the carbon with, like what I was referring before, the natural fires and everything, but there's a much better way, more environmental and more efficient way of doing it. And actually, it's not that expensive. It is not that expensive. From the benefits of biochar, that there are many in the soil because you improve the soil tremendously, besides the carbon. If you start putting everything into a scale, you will see that it's not expensive at all. And we are trying to improve our systems and make it more scalable and bigger. So actually you can produce biochar more inexpensively. But from all the carbon sequestration technologies, I would think that we are one of the cheapest one by far. And not just cheapest one because we can produce CO2 cheaply, but more so because by doing so, we're also improving the soil and many other things in the soil as well. And like what I was telling before, you can use it for filtration first, and then you can use it in the soil. It's just a wonderful platform that you can use, for many several uses.
Well, the next question sounds like one I would have asked, but it's not from me, Bernie, it's somebody else. I asked, what's the difference between fast and slow pyrolysis, and which is better for biochar production?
Excellent. All right, we're starting like the discussion that we have in your lab. I probably is one of your other students. So fast and slow, okay, and we're actually in the middle. But fast pyrolysis, it's few seconds. That's how you do it. And in the lab, we just grind it very finely, and then it goes into reactors very hot, and then it vaporizes very quickly the particles. That is fast, a couple of seconds, maybe a minute. Slow pyrolysis, generally it's referred to 30 minutes to 2 hours, all right? And there's some carbonization technologies, which is actually hours to days. So that's fast and that's slow. We're in the middle. Our systems roughly process between 15 and 1 hour of residence time. So for making biochar, I mean, you can do it with both. You need to see the system as a whole, but we recommend making more carbon, more charcoal. So when you go slower, you get more of the solid residue, not so much of the volatiles or the gases that you produce as well.
Very, very good. And as we all know, is Bernie advocates for slow pyrolysis, and I advocate for fast pyrolysis. But Bernie has made a really good point. Is the slow pyrolysis is probably a much lower capital cost technology to put in place, but it depends on what the value of that biochar is. Do you have any idea what the public might be willing to pay for biochar? And I say the public, I mean entities that want to be able to get credits for sequestering carbon.
Excellent. So in Puro, in the platform that I was referring from Europe, we're selling the carbon credits from $150 a ton of CO2.
Now we're selling. Okay.
Now we're selling. So, and this is a tricky concept, but every ton of biochar can sequester up to roughly 3 tons of CO2. Why is that? Because the biochar is so dense in carbon that when you burn it, you start adding, and now that molecule is 3 times, heavier. So a ton of biochar can sequester, depends how you make it, up to roughly 3 tons of CO2. So you see how effective we can do it. We can produce a lot of CO2, sequester a lot of CO2 in our biochars very easily and put it in the soil.
And that's an important point to make. Often the sequestration is measured in tons of CO2 equivalent because that's what the typical fossil fuel plant is going to emit. in this case, you truly are sequestering carbon instead of carbon dioxide, which packs more power in the punch than if you did CO2. So that's a really important point. Interestingly, there was a direct air capture plant in Iceland just established. It's costing them between $600 and $800 a ton of CO2 sequestered for that direct air capture approach. And yet the stories that I've read is companies were lining up to buy those credits. You're saying that you could capture it for a lot less than $600 to $800 a ton of
Absolutely.
CO2.
For half of that, we can make big systems for sequestering carbon. And now, like I was telling you, a quarter of that we are doing it right now. And don't forget on all the other benefits that biochar have, which are incredible. You know, biochar. I have plants growing in 100% of biochar as a soil media. It works wonderfully, and no better so. We can grab the biochar, filter, any organics, anything, and use it in the compost. So you're double dipping your benefits, and like that, there are many situations that we can do that. So absolutely, we can cut down price on our biochar if we do it, intelligently. But one of the things that we are doing is we're using waste biomass that in some cases you need to get rid of, and there's tipping fees, and you contaminate, or you have piles of biomass sitting there and produce methane and fermenting, all the stuff. Well, the same, double dipping. That is perfect feedstock for us. We can pretty much process anything. Anything that has carbon and energy, you can turn it into biochar, pretty much, generally speaking.
Bernie, there's a question that came, like one you might ask a graduate student in their final defense. You said only 50% of the carbon was actually sequestered. That means the other 50% ended up in the atmosphere as CO2. That sounds terrible. How do you justify that?
So no, it's not terrible. I would say it's normal and it's natural. It's nature. So anything there's inefficiencies in it. So let's go to the basics. Can be done 100, absolutely, with other technologies that you can couple to. The way of how we do it, because we need some of the energy in the system, some of that energy that you use in the non-condensable gases and the bio oil, you burn it to provide the heat for the carbonization, which actually it needs energy to carbonize and fuse these aromatic rings. So 50% it goes into the biochar, but that's not a problem at all, because normally you have 100% of that carbon that would be emitted back into the atmosphere. And now I'm telling you, you know what? 50% you're locking it down, and next year that 50% that it was in the air is back in the plant again, and you're sequestering 50% more. So it's like a compound effect on your interest rate, right? No, you are every year that CO2 that is in the air, you're sequestering half, and you're sequestering half, and you're sequestering half. You're effectively removing CO2 from the air. And our technology, I will emphasize one more time, is carbon negative, all right? So as we produce biochar, we are effectively sequester, as we make more biochar, we're sequestering CO2. So if we see it in a historical line, we have 50 tons, and when we finish the production of biochar in the year, we'll have 25 tons, because we effectively sequester that. And as the more we produce biochar, the more we're sequestering carbon in the biochar and in the soils. So it's a carbon negative technology.
So you're making a point that there is a difference between fossil carbon dioxide emissions and so-called biogenic carbon dioxide emissions, those from fossil fuels versus from plants. And so you're able to achieve actually a potentially carbon negative, our carbon removal scheme is what you have achieved with biochar. Well, Bernie, I always knew you as a student as being an entrepreneur. So when you started a business, I wasn't surprised at all. Do you have advice for soon to be graduates from Iowa State University on how they should approach this notion of becoming an entrepreneur? Do you encourage it? What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, yeah, this route is not for everyone, but I would say there are many people that would enjoy being taken with my colleagues in developing this company. So the first thing that I tell everyone is you don't know until you try it. So you need to try it. Would you go into academia? Would you go into the industrial world? Well, you got to try it. So you need to try it. And if you like it, be ready to beat yourself for several years, 5, 10 years, until you have the ducks in the row. And that takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of money, a lot of family time, and and eventually happens. But there's a lot of things that needs to happen in order to become, entrepreneur, that actually develop your company, develop your progress and everything. And sometimes it can be done while you're working, again, in other areas. But in my case, I decided to dive right in, because this is a wonderful technology. We need to develop it more. We need more people. If you want to help us, contact me. And it takes a lot of time and effort. So the more you do it, the faster it comes out, makes into reality.
Well, I've got a question. I'm going to identify this is Dr. David Laird, so you'll be prepared for this question, Bernie.
I think I know my comment.
Biochar has been associated with both positive and negative priming when put in agricultural soils. What is the difference, and can this be controlled? What do you think?
That was the question that he wanted to ask me in the defense, but I didn't give him the time for that.
Oh boy, it's a blast from the past. Okay, you're going to
exactly. So excellent. I want to put into perspective to people what is a negative priming effect. So a few things. The biochar, let's put it in simple terms, sequester a lot of carbon. Negative priming effects, absolutely, there's priming effect. In general, you're going to put so much carbon into the soil that the soil itself can release some carbon because of natural processes. For example, that biochar is alkaline, and then you put it in a soil and you neutralize some of the acidity of that soil. And guess what? You're producing CO2, right? But into perspective, if I'm putting 10 tons of biochar in an acre, is let's say 20 or 30 tons of CO2. It's a lot. So the negative priming effect that you might have in that soil is minimum, right? And you would have it with dolomite or calcite if you were to adjust that pH in soil. And there's lots of other things. But I want you to, the carbon world is very complicated. So there's priming negative and there's priming positive effect. So the biochar, we said it doesn't break down, right? We put it in the soil, and in general terms, it doesn't break down, it stays there. But then you might have positive feedbacks from all the microbes, all the root development, all the organic matter that you create in the soil, because now you have a sponge that holds more water, more nutrients, more microbes, and then your soil becomes a carbon generating or carbon sequestration itself, because you have that positive impact, positive feedback into the soil. So the negative, yes, absolutely, there is. In general, it's very little. The positive could be huge, and that's we shouldn't get off the target, because we put a lot of carbon in the biochar, and if you do it right, you should have a great positive impact of extra carbon in the soil for parallel systems, parallel processes that are going on.
So I'm going to guess that's also a function of the type of biochar, how it was produced primarily. Could you talk a little bit about differences? I'm not asking you to say your biochar is better than company B and C, but can you talk a little bit about what makes a superior biochar? And I'm sure ARTi is producing some really great stuff, but can you tell us why?
Yeah, that's a great funny question, because I have it so much. Is that what is how I make the best quality biochar? And I'm sorry to tell you, but there's no such a thing. You have the best quality biochar for that specific situation, and that specific situation changes a lot. But in general terms, as we refer in the past, you can make biochar from many different processes, stocks, and different operating conditions. Guess what? You get different carbons. Some carbons are better in this situation, these other carbons are better in some other situations, and they're different. So you need to understand where you're putting it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I got a very acidic soil, like the rainforest soils that we were just talking about. Well, if you make a basic biochar with have high cation exchange capacities with a high liming effect, those are going to be absolutely beneficial, right? But if you do the same in a high pH soil like what we have, those mineral carbon carbonate formations and very basic soils, you put that same basic biochar in it, you're going to have problems. You're going to have all sorts of immobilization and chelation of micronutrients, and a bunch of other things. You're going to impact the plant negatively. And a more common way, and this is all the biochar enthusiasts that they're out there, we like to say inoculate your biochar. You're getting something that comes out of the reactor that it's dead. And it's not only dead, it has lots of chemical reactions potentials when you put it into soil. So don't put that biochar right away on top of your plant. What I like to do, and what I always recommend, is mix it with compost. Couple, let's say 2 weeks. If you cannot do 2 weeks, do 1 day. Mix it with compost, and then you add it to the soil. Otherwise, you put it into the soil and start sucking all the nutrients from the soil. Start releasing back again. But again, you're having a chemical sponge, a water sponge that you put in on top of a seed that is trying to grow, and that could be very, very detrimental. So there's no better quality. We make acidic biochar for some situations. We make biochar with low conductivity for saline surfaces, for saline applications. In general, if you want to do carbon sequestration, you would say, you know what, I want more of this organic carbon that is recalcitrant. And what is your better quality biochar? With more organic carbon, so that char can sequester 3 tons of CO2 for every ton of biochar. But again, it just depends on what you're going to use it, the situation, and how you make it. So there's no better quality biochar. We can call me and we can discuss that.
So if you're advocating for doing a composting with the biochar, that may be related to one of the questions about having heard that often you should consider mixing manure and biochar. Is this the same kind of effect that you're talking about when you do the composting, when you're mixing it with manure?
Yep, absolutely. A couple of things is, we like to say inoculation of the biochar, because you inoculate it with nutrients and microbes. The biochar part, the biological part of biochar that we don't know, in my opinion, is enormous and is one of the best things in the soil. Besides the chemical and the physical improvements in the soil, which they are also enormous. But the biological part, I think we're way behind in science. We need a lot more. So what I'm trying to say is, first of all, you inoculate it. You put nutrients, microbes, and water, because you need to start all these chemical reactions in the soil. So you need to do that in some way. An easy way is mixing with compost. Manure for sure is going to work. Careful with the manure, because it could be too hot, like what people say, it's too hot. So you need to compost and manure and biochar, depends how much you add. And we also add chemical fertilizer for some clients to the biochar, at least so we don't have immobilization of nutrients. And also we do organic fertilizer or organic amendments into the biochar, and we sell that. So again, it depends what situations you're going to be using it and what you want to do from that biochar. Imagine that biochar, you have heavy metals on soil and something. Well, you just need biochar for doing immobilization of those things. If you're trying to do, pH, buffering of that soil, well, you're looking the biochar itself. But in general, you're looking biochar as a whole, as a substrate for those nutrients, microbes, waters, and structural changes in the soil. And it's a little more complex, but.
Would you care to elaborate on the difference of carbon sequestration in the form of carbon dioxide versus biochar?
Absolutely.
Advantages, challenges, between the two?
Okay. We're getting into topics that it takes me at least 20 minutes to explain, and you're asking me.
Well, I'm not sure we had that time, but I thought you might want to take a stab at that.
Yeah. I will make it. Okay, I can put a disclaimer. But
what's the basic difference between those two approaches, biochar versus carbon dioxide sequestration?
So carbon dioxide sequestration, in the form that we're typically saying, is grab that CO2 and we're going to compress it and inject it in the soil, or we're going to mix it with some chemicals and it's going to stay in those chemicals, right? Fantastic. We need all the solutions for climate change. We need them all right? We say that ours is much better. Why? Because in our cases, the original biomass that is there, that we concentrate that carbon into the biochar, and it's not CO2, it's carbon structures, aromatic carbon structures. And then that has many, many more benefits than the carbon storage itself. So it's way different. But all the other carbon technologies that are out there, it's great. You grab a gas, concentrate it, pump it, inject it here and there. And there are many other disadvantages as well. In ours, there are disadvantages, but there are many, many more advantages in what we are doing.
In other words, CO2, you actually are entombing it and getting no economic value out of it other than you removed it from the atmosphere, versus biochar, you're saying you get ecosystem services in addition to carbon sequestration, and that seems like a win-win in that case.
Exactly.
Okay. Do you have anything else you would like to tell the audience in general?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, we see CO2 and the problem with CO2 and climate change like something that the government or the climate or the institution and the petroleum companies, and I would say, yes, it's a problem of all, but you can do. That's why we call our program I Trap CO2, because you can go and buy 50 pounds of CO2 and we'll donate that biochar to any institutions that you would want. And you contact that and say, you know what, I want to donate it to Iowa State, to the Bioeconomy Institute, emailing us, we produce a biochar and we give it to you guys. So first of all, it's a problem of everyone, but we can all do something. That's the number one question. The other thing is biochar for carbon sequestration is coming, and it's coming hard. So I would say support it, understand more, and and read a little bit. But we all need to do our part, and yeah, we're starting now. So the other thing is we also made a presentation with more information for the general public that we're gonna put in ARTi.com, ARTi.com, and also iTrapCO2, and CO2 is CO and 2.com. That we're gonna put there, so there's more information. So if you have questions, you go to that presentation and hopefully they are answered. Otherwise, you contact us. But yes, we have more information on our website, the same. And if you have any question, concerns, or projects or something, contact us.
Well, I do have one late question coming in. Do you have any insights on the possibility of plant disease management using biochar?
Absolutely. So definitely, in general, if you have a healthier soil, you have healthier plants. Pest and disease happen with an unbalanced ecosystem in some way. So if you can improve the health of that soil, you absolutely have less problems on your plant. So that is the basic. Then on a specific situations, we need to see, because maybe, you always, it's biology, and biology is complicated. But in general terms, that's what you should get.
Very good. And I think we're reaching the end of our discussion. Thank you, Bernie. We really appreciate getting to talk to you again and seeing how your company is thriving to its growth as there is more and more interest in carbon removal and carbon sequestration. I would like to invite everyone back on November 2nd for our conversations about carbon. Our guest for that conversation is Dr. Tom Richard, who's a professor at Pennsylvania State University. Thank you again for everyone's participation and Bernie's participation.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for the invitation.